Welcome to CivilNet. My guest is attorney Nicholas Koumjian, who is an international criminal attorney. And that means that he has worked in the Ukraine, in Colombia, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Cambodia, in Sierra Leone, lives at The Hague, in the Netherlands, and works at the International Criminal Court there, and is currently involved in a series of cases, including being the principal trial attorney for the prosecution of the Special Court of Sierra Leone. He is working to represent two individuals in a case involving charges of an attack on a peacekeeping mission in Darfur. He is working part-time on the upcoming appeal of the judgment in the case of the prosecutor versus Charles Taylor. And he is here in Armenia these days because you're teaching a quick course at American University of Armenia?
Yeah. Well, I'm here at participating in a course at the AUA involving international criminal law. I contacted Tom Samuelian, the dean, and because I missed Armenia, looking for a reason to come back for a while, so I'm here for 3 weeks to be a guest lecturer in that course.
Welcome to Armenia. Welcome back to Armenia. Welcome to CivilNet. You were in Armenia in the 90s.
Yes, I was here with the American Bar Association in 1997 in a project where I was working as an advisor with the parliamentary committee that was redrafting at that time the Criminal Code and Criminal Procedure Code.
You are of counsel in the firm of Giragos and Giragos, and Armenians, of course, in Armenia know Mark Giragos, if nothing else, from his participation in the Armenia Fund telethons. And but even as of counsel there, you really live in The Hague, and you really do international criminal prosecution full time.
Yes, I've been doing the international criminal cases for 12 years. I was a prosecutor in Los Angeles for the County of Los Angeles for 20 years. And then in 2000, I was lucky enough to get an offer through the United Nations to work at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. At the time, I took a leave of absence for a couple of years, but I've never gone back to Los Angeles.
A long leave of absence.
Yes.
You know, I think each of us has some understanding of how criminal courts work in national jurisdictions. How does it work in the international world? How are jurisdictions defined? Who hires you? Who fires you? Is there a hierarchy?
Well, what makes working in the field of international criminal law interesting is that really this is very much developing. It's not in its teenage years. It's not even in its childhood. We're still in the infancy. After the Second World War, we had Nuremberg, which was a very different type of proceeding where the victors decided to bring to justice those responsible for crimes. And nothing happened after Nuremberg until the Bosnian War broke out. There was so much pressure on the world, particularly in Europe and the European powers, to respond to what were reports of concentration camps in Europe and all of these things from the Second World War that seemed to be happening again. So it started with the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, and then the UN set up a separate tribunal for Rwanda after the genocide there a couple years later. A few other attempts were made in East Timor. The United Nations established a unit. I worked there for a while. And in Sierra Leone, there was a terrible civil war for 10 years. And in the year 2000, the government of Sierra Leone requested the United Nations assistance in establishing a court to bring to justice those most responsible. So that court was set up not by a Security Council resolution like Rwanda and Yugoslavia, but it was set up by a treaty between the United Nations and the government of Sierra Leone. And then since that time, around the same time that the Sierra Leone court was set up, the International Criminal Court began operations in July 2002. I'm working on one case there, that's the Darfur case that you mentioned. But that court, of course, people believe is the future of international criminal law. But again, it is still very much finding its way. In 10 years, that court has now completed one trial through verdict, and that's the Lubanga case that'll now go on appeal.
There was so much what's the right word, discussion, debate at the time that the International Criminal Court, the ICC, was being set up about countries afraid to ratify that treaty because they were afraid of losing, what is it called, national
sovereignty.
And now, 10 years later, Are the fears still there?
Well, certainly some countries still have that fear, but there are about 120, I forget the exact number, but approximately 120 nations have now signed the treaty and joined the International Criminal Court. Of course, it is hard for countries, especially those that are in conflicts or likely to be in conflicts, to agree to the court exercising jurisdiction over crimes on their territory. But some countries that have been involved in conflicts, such as Great Britain, the United Kingdom, and France, are members of the court. And many believe, and I believe, that the sacrifice of sovereignty is necessary for us to really achieve justice universally in all countries.
So I guess what I'm hearing is that in countries such as the UK and others that are, enlightened, modern, more democratic, there is a tolerance for debate decisions that may not be what I personally might want, but it's the will of the institution and will go forward. But then in countries like Sierra Leone, it's almost like a form of closure, like a way of moving on?
Well, definitely I believe that these trials are necessary. When you say closure, I think that is a good word, but for those who were victimized, for those who suffered, there is not a feeling of justice until there is justice. And it's very important to them that those most responsible be brought to justice. We saw that very much in Sierra Leone. I remember one witness that I called to testify against Taylor, Mustafa Mansoure. He was just a farmer, uneducated, and he had had his hands cut off by the rebels in the war. He also happened to be in a wheelchair because of a stroke. And the last question we asked him was, why did you agree to come all the way from Africa to testify? And he said, because a long time ago, a man, the president of Liberia, sitting across the room, Charles Taylor, said we in Sierra Leone would taste the bitterness of war. And he held up the stumps of his arms and he said, this is the bitterness I've tasted. And for me, that moment was what international justice is about, that a man who was victimized like that is facing on equal terms the president of a country, and the court is treating them both equally, and justice is done for what happened to a very simple man by a very powerful man.
I guess the most obvious next question then, since we're sitting in Armenia, two Armenians talking about international justice, is the following, that often many in the Armenian communities around the world and in Armenia say that what we really need is to take Turkey as the successor of the Ottoman Empire to court, international courts, to seek justice. I personally have always thought that's risky, not because I don't think we are in the just or deserve justice, but because this is such a political issue. It's not just a criminal justice issue. And so my answer is, why would I submit this to political games and political bazaars? Am I being cynical?
Well, I believe that certainly that is a cynical point of view. There's some element of realism to it. Of course, for the current courts that are set up, such as the International Criminal Court, there would be no jurisdiction over crimes that happened before 2002. The idea of the court, though, is that if something like that, if genocides, crimes against humanity are happening now, even if they're happening against a poor country, even if they're happening against a country that has no political power, even if it's happening within a country against a minority in that country, these crimes can be brought to justice because we recognize that sometimes national courts will not prosecute those who, or cannot prosecute those who are responsible. So the idea of the international criminal courts is the principle of complementarity. If a country is able and willing to handle its own case, that the international court does not have jurisdiction. If it's not, then it goes to the international court.
Who decides that, able and willing?
Well, ultimately it would be up to the judges to decide that, and the state that's involved, for example, can object to it. Kenya, for example, objects to the International Criminal Court doing cases from Kenya, and the Sudan obviously objected to the International Criminal Court handling the genocide. It's charged as genocide against the president of Sudan, in Darfur. So ultimately, it would be up to judges, and these are judges from the state parties, all the states that have signed the treaty, and that are elected by a vote of all the state parties. But in the real world, of course, nothing is completely divorced from politics, and I would be naive to tell you that politics plays no role. Some people have some very creative ideas I've heard about, but I'm not an expert on possible courts that could hear cases that happened long ago. But it wouldn't be the modern international criminal courts.
Last question. In Armenia, we hear less about the International Criminal Court. We're less involved, engaged in those processes, and more in the European Court of Human Rights. Where does that fit into this international criminal justice process?
Well, it's similar in one way in that the European Court of Human Rights also involves countries sacrificing a bit of their sovereignty, agreeing to have their courts supervised in a way by a supranational court, the European Court of Human Rights, that all of the member states participate in. But it handles different cases. It can handle any case involving fundamental rights guaranteed by the European Convention for Human Rights, while the international criminal courts are limited by their statutes to certain crimes, genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity.
Well, we will stay at the European Court of Human Rights. Thank goodness. Thank you, Nicholas Koumjian, international criminal attorney in Armenia now for a couple of weeks to teach at American University of Armenia. Thank you for watching CivilNet. I think the issue of international criminal justice is something that Armenia, as a member of the international community, is something that we need to understand more and better. Thank you for joining us.